Right, bring it on, the histology of the stomach. Last week we were looking at the histology of the esophagus, and I said that the organisation of the layers of the esophagus would be the same throughout the gastrointestinal tract. So I guess we get to find out today if I'm talking rubbish or not. But I said that you had the epithelium, and then you had lamina propria around that, then a muscle layer, then the submucosa, then more muscle layers, bit of connective tissue around the outside, and that made our tube for the esophagus. We'll see the same thing in the stomach, but we need to think about what the functions of the stomach are, and what we'll be looking at is the epithelium. The epithelium is going to be quite different because the jobs that the stomach has to do are quite different. Also, what is stomach acid all about? A couple of different cell types to look at. Most days there is no chainsaw activity outside my office. Today somebody's decided to start using a chainsaw. Anyway, what does the stomach do? Okay, well the stomach is it's a bag, so when you eat a meal, the meal goes into the stomach. The stomach then stores that food for a little while, so it's got a storage function because it releases a little bit of its contents, chyme, into the small intestine. Little bits, so it's got this storage and slow release job. It also has digestive roles. It releases enzymes that help digest, help break down the food before passing it into the intestines. Also has a role of mechanical digestion, so the stomach will move the food around, it'll churn it around to help with digestion. Does a little bit of absorption as well, so it'll absorb water, it'll absorb alcohol, it'll absorb some drugs. So if you drink a lot of water to make yourself feel full, it doesn't last very long because the stomach's quite good at absorbing water. But the stomach doesn't really absorb many nutrients because the small intestine is so much better than that. We'll see later, in later weeks, how the small intestine, that's the part of the GI tract that's going to do a lot of absorption. Right, I've got two slides, and obviously the stomach is a lot bigger than the esophagus. So this is just a bit of the wall of the stomach. Now this is the body of the stomach. I've got another bit of the stomach here. I've done another video on the anatomy of the stomach, but the stomach is mostly body, but it's got different bits, and in different regions of the stomach it will be a little bit different. We'll find slightly different cells there doing slightly different things, but the histology of the stomach can get really complicated, and we'll see why. It's actually quite simple, but it can get quite confusing, so we'll try and keep it simple, right, because that's useful. So we're focusing on the body of the stomach. Right, what do we got? Bum, bum, bum. Okay. So that down there that's outside the stomach. That's like the shiny bit. Then we've got the muscle, and then we've got submucosa, a little bit more muscle. Lamina propria there is kind of mixed up with the epithelium. It looks like I'm not talking rubbish. It does look like it's got the same layout as the esophagus. But look at that epithelium. Right, there's a lot going on there. So what is going on there? Oh, that looks like a good bit over there. Let's have a bit of that bit. Oh, looks like it's got a bit of a blob in it. Okay, so this is my low power objective. This is times 4, and then times 10 to my eyes makes a total of times 40. Jump up to the times 10 objective. As I've said before, the magnification view will be a bit different depending upon what size your screen is. There's my wheel. There it is. What do you think of that? So that there is the lumen. That's inside the stomach. That's where the food would be. That's the epithelium that's up against the food. And then we've got all this underneath it. Can you spot the muscle layer there? Right, okay. So this clearly is the epithelium. And we're seeing some big folds here. It's going to be important that you don't confuse these folds with the folds that we see in the small intestine. They're different, they've got different names. I see the names and the functions get confused quite a bit. But what we're looking at there, we're looking at gastric pits. So if you were looking at the surface of the stomach, like at the flat surface of the epithelium, I know the epithelium is actually very folded so the stomach can expand, but imagine you're looking at a flat bit of the epithelium, you'd see millions of tiny little holes in the surface of the epithelium inside the stomach, and those are the gastric pits. So there's a hole that goes into a pit, and that's what we're looking at here. But of course that tubular pit that's going into the mucosa, it might be a bit wiggly, might be at a bit of a funky angle, and because we're cutting thin sections through the tissue here, these sections are probably about 10 microns, 10 micrometers thick, depending upon whether we've got we've cut on the same axis as that pit, as to whether we see the pit like that or whether we see these sorts of shapes over here. Can you imagine that we've got glancing blows to those gastric pits, which is why they look different here. So that's what the stomach looks like. So you can see the tops of some pits and then the pits further down, but those are all gastric pits, and that's why I selected these over here, is because they're most complete. They've been sectioned on the same plane as the pits. Let's jump into the higher power. So what's this, the 20 times objective? We can see what we're playing with here. Now, so that's the epithelium. It is a single layer of cells, so it's a simple epithelium. The cells are tall, so it's a columnar epithelium, so it's a simple columnar epithelium. And there are, well, the cells here are, there are a lot of surface mucus cells, SMCs. I don't like abbreviations. Surface mucus cells, these are cells on the surface making a lot of mucus. Why are they making a lot of mucus? Because of stomach acid. The stomach, these cells here, the lining of the stomach, the epithelium of the stomach, the mucosa, whatever you want to call it, needs to be protected from the acid that the cells in here are going to produce. And they do that by producing a mucus, and it's a slightly alkaline mucus that covers the surface. It's a pretty good arrangement. So we have a lot of surface mucus cells, and we can see the epithelium folding down into those gastric pits, folding into those dips. Oh look, there's a bit of a double one there. And down here, these cells, we would call these the gastric glands. We've got lots of cells in there producing the things that are going to help with digestion. We'll get to that in a minute. But the concept I need to get across is that these gastric pits are these little tiny tubes extending down from the surface, and really they continue and they branch into different directions, and the gastric glands, the cells, secrete their secretions into really the deeper parts of the gastric pits, which we would call the gastric glands. So the gastric pits are near the surface and the gastric glands are down here. So down in the, you can see that the cells down here look quite different to the cells up here. So these cells have got one job, mostly producing mucus, and the cells down here have got a different job, producing things to help with digestion. How's that? Because that's quite a hard thing to understand, that's quite a hard thing to describe. All right, let's jump up to the, see, it's the 40 times objective. So 400 times magnification for me. It's got a little bit soft. What can I do? Now, this it's not terribly stained. It could have a bit more stain on this one, but all right. So there's the lumen where the food is, there's the surface, and there are some nice examples there of gastric pits. I think you can see the shape that I'm trying to describe. And you can see those cells there. The nucleus is down towards the bottom, so essentially this is a very folded epithelium all those epithelial cells will still be attached to a basement membrane. So the nuclei are near the basement membrane, they're near the bottom of the cell. And then we've got lots of cytoplasm extending towards the surface, and we've got a lot of, the cell's producing a lot of stuff that's going to be released from the surface of the cell into the lumen or into the gastric pit. So as you go down the gastric pit, if we had the perfect section, we could follow that down and see that central tube probably splitting into 2 or 3 different directions. And that's why we lose it, because it's not continuing in that direction, it's going off into different planes, it's going off in different directions. But those surface mucus cells become neck mucus cells as we go down. But then as we get down into this layer here, these cells are all the cells of the gastric glands. And they do have some shape, they do have some structure, they're surrounding tubes which are connecting with these gastric pits. But there are 4 types of cells down here that we're interested in. We have parietal cells, we have chief cells, and then we have neuroendocrine cells, and we have stem cells. So the stem cells, the progenitor cells, are, like every epithelium, they're actually not down at the bottom, they're kind of midway, and they can go up and down. The stem cells make more epithelial cells, they make more cells of the mucosa. The neuroendocrine cells make endocrine signals, hormones, like gastrin. The reason I think this gets complicated is that most of these cells here are parietal cells and chief cells, but they've got a whole bunch of different names, which is why it gets confusing. Can you imagine that little, can you see that? We've got a little bit of a branching one there, right? Can you imagine how those branches are continuing out? We've got another one a bit further along, right? Can you imagine how those branches are continuing? That's what we mean by the gastric glands as we get down there. Now, these cells. Parietal cells make hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor it's going to be useful later. So vitamin B12 gets absorbed from our food in the ileum, later on in the small intestine. The intrinsic factor released in the stomach helps with vitamin B12 absorption. That's all we need to describe at this point. But the parietal cells make hydrochloric acid. Okay, that's a big important one. This is where stomach acid comes from. These cells also get called oxyntic cells. And you might read about oxyntic glands. That's referring to the parietal cells. The chief cells make pepsinogen, a precursor to pepsin. So here's the problem. We eat protein, we want to break that protein up into amino acids, and we want to use it as building blocks, most of the time, for making proteins in ourselves. We're made of proteins, but we want to digest proteins. So how do we digest proteins without digesting ourselves? So pepsinogen, released by the chief cells in here, pepsinogen is a precursor to pepsin. So at a neutral pH, so most of the tissues in the body are at a neutral pH of about pH 7. Pepsinogen, it's inactive. It's shaped in such a way, it's conformed in such a way that it's not going to digest proteins. Great. So the cells release that, and that goes out into the stomach and mixes with the food. The hydrochloric acid also gets pushed out into the stomach and mixes with the food. Now pepsinogen, when it's in an environment where the pH is around 1.5 to 2.5, so when the pH is acidic, the pepsinogen protein changes shape and a bit gets chopped off, and it becomes pepsin. And pepsin will then enzymatically degrade, chop up proteins. So it becomes a proteinase. So that's a really cool solution. We make a proteinase, a protein digesting enzyme that's safely packaged, move it away from the cells that are producing it, mix it with acid, and then it reconforms to become active, and then it'll break down the food. And then of course the surface mucus cells have covered the surface of the stomach with an alkaline mucus, so that's buffering the pH next to the cells of the epithelium, protecting them, right? Which is great. But what would happen if you lost that mucus layer? What would happen if acid from the stomach went up into the esophagus where there isn't a protecting mucus layer? You know, there are some things to consider here. But that's what's going on here. That's what stomach acid is all about. The chief cells are also called zymogenic cells. Zymogen, that relates to the proteinase bit. They're also called peptic cells. And chief cells also produce gastric lipase. So a lipase would digest fats. I don't think it does a huge amount of work, but it's in there. And that's what we're seeing here. So if we bump up to the higher power again, the cells that we're looking at here, I don't know if you can see, but there's a couple of different types, and they look a couple of different ways. We've got these maybe pinky fried eggs. So you've got a nice round purple nucleus. We can see the nucleolus in there as well. And then the cytoplasm of these cells is quite pink, and the cell as a whole is quite round. And then we're seeing some other cells kind of like the segments of an orange with a hole in the middle, maybe, if we get the section right, or a little bit of a you know, like a long space in the middle, because there's a bunch of cells around a duct, and they secrete into that duct. So if the duct is a long tube, depending upon whether we've cut the duct like this or cut the duct like this, it might look in different ways. So that's the other cell type. So those cells have got, they're not pinky, they kind of got a bit of a purpley cytoplasm. We can see some little marks in the cytoplasm. And the nuclei are still fairly round, but maybe not so much in the middle. So those are the two main types of cells that we're looking at here. So which is which? Which are the chief cells, and which are the parietal cells? Well, the parietal cells that are making hydrochloric acid are the pinky fried eggs. So we can see, I mean, if we're trying to differentiate the two different cell types here, we can see lots that are pink and lots that are not pink, right? So the ones that are properly pink, those are the ones making hydrochloric acid. Those are the parietal cells. Why are they called, so parietal means wall. I mean, it's the wall of the stomach. Why are they called parietal cells, I wonder? And then the other cells, so if the stain had been left for longer, the chief cells might look a bit more purpley than this. So I don't know how to describe it, but I think I've got them right in the middle there. Those chief cells, they're not pink, and they just kind of look glandy. They look really, really glandy. And in some sections we're seeing like there's a nice circular arrangement of chief cells there, which are producing pepsinogen. So these are the ones producing a proteinase, producing an enzyme. That's why they look so different to the hydrochloric acid producing cells. So the chief cells look, yeah, they look like the segments of an orange if you get the right section. They just kind of look, they look like they're producing proteins, producing enzymes. I've been looking at slides too long, haven't I? They've got that certain look to them. Anyway, that there, those are the gastric glands. Those are the two major cell types in there that we're most interested in. So we've gone from the surface here, the lumen, we've got the epithelium, that simple columnar epithelium, those surface mucus cells, and we followed the gastric pits down. That is such a lovely shape, that, isn't it? Look at that. Oh, beautiful. The gastric pits down, we see that branching into the gastric glands, and down in the gastric glands here we see the chief cells and the parietal cells. And then as we go down, so actually this is the lamina propria here. So the lamina propria is the connective tissue supporting the epithelium. And if we go down there, we can see a bit of the lamina propria, but essentially the gastric glands are in the lamina propria. The lamina propria is moving in and supporting them. But we can see a bit of connective tissue there, right? Those stringy shapes and those flatter cells. So there's the lamina propria, that connective tissue layer, and then the next layer next to it, we've got a very thin muscle layer here. So this is the muscularis mucosa, and this thin, smooth muscle layer is probably going to help squeeze this tube and help squeeze the contents out of the glands into the gastric pits, maybe. So those three things together, essentially the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa, all those three things together make up the mucosa. And then the next layer is the submucosa, and we're seeing blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics and connective tissue and what have you in there. So the submucosa is quite thin here, and then the next layer out we're seeing muscle. So now we're in the stomach, so this has got to be smooth muscle, autonomic muscle, and look, that it's not a lot of stain on this. It's quite light, but you can see that the fibres there are running in one direction, and the fibres there are running in another direction. Now the stomach's a bit special because actually we talk about in the GI tract how you have circular muscles running around the tube and longitudinal muscles running the length of the tube, and that's what they work together to give peristalsis. But the stomach also has some oblique fibres running around it, which helps with the mechanical digestion thing, moving everything around inside the stomach and then squirting it, squeezing it out into the duodenum. Is all of this quite lightly stained? Yeah, it is. But so look there. Oh, look at that. So there is there's the mucosa, the epithelium, and what have you. There's the muscularis mucosa, and look, so now we're in the submucosa. Look at these three tubes, aren't they pretty? So we've got two blood vessels there. One's got a thicker wall, one's got a thinner wall. We can see them filled with blood cells which aren't staining. So we have a little venule there and a little artery. The little arteriole is the one with the thicker wall. And then look, right next to them down here, there's another little tube, another little circle with hardly a wall at all. It looks very much like the venule. So that must be a lymphatic vessel, right? Isn't that neat? So this is what the submucosa is then, where we'll find blood vessels and, like I say, nerves and all sorts. The supporting structures supporting the stomach, and then out here, there's the muscle layer. So can you see that in this section this is a transverse section through bundles of muscle fibres running in that direction. So that's a transverse section through the next layer of muscle, and then out here, this is a longitudinal section through this layer of muscle there. So we've got those two layers of muscle, just as we saw in the esophagus and just as we'll see through the rest of the GI tract. Now the layer out from there would be there'd be a serosa, an adventitia. We're seeing it's very lightly staining, but there's a thin connective tissue covering the stomach, holding it all together. So that, the outer part, we're seeing again a few little blood vessels in there. So there's a serosa covering the stomach. When you look at a real stomach, that's why it's shiny. It's covered in serosa, and of course it's covered in peritoneum as well. There we go. Look, there's a bit of very lightly staining, but we've got some, looks like some fat cells and some blood vessels and what have you in there. And that's it. That's the anatomy or the histology, the cellular arrangement of the stomach. Look, if we go from the outside, we've got a layer of muscle, submucosa, thin layer of muscle, gastric glands up against the lamina propria, and the gastric pits. Such a pretty section. Now those folds, don't mix them up with what we'll talk about when we'll talk about the small intestine. The job of the small intestine is about absorption. It's about maximizing surface area. Here, this is a structure that's producing mucus and producing hydrochloric acid and producing pepsinogen to break down proteins. Oh, I could almost get all the layers in there. So we've looked at the histological structure of the stomach. We've talked about the cells and their functions. We've seen how it's similar to the esophagus. And we know what stomach acid's all about. And we understand that there are protective mechanisms to protect the cells from the acid, but the acid is it's a necessary evil, really. This is a section of pylorus. So the pylorus of the stomach, that's the last bit of the stomach before we get to the small intestine, before we get to the duodenum. And the pylorus, there's a thick muscular sphincter that keeps the food in the stomach while it's munching everything around and doing that mechanical digestion bit. So if we look at this, and this is quite a heavily stained section, we're only going to look at this briefly, not in too much detail. I think I've given you enough information already. But look at this, is still the lowest power. Look at all this muscle, 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 and it's all in blocks. They're all kind of running in an organised fashion, slightly different directions, but that's all muscle. And then that last bit here, there's the epithelium. So that's so much muscle. So muscle. So this is the muscle layers, by the way, called the muscularis externa. So muscle, 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 muscle. Then the muscle then is up against the submucosa, where we've got, if we go over here, we can see quite nicely actually. In the submucosa, we've got blood vessels, little arteries, little veins, lymphatics, nerves. And then we've got that thin layer of muscle in there, the muscularis mucosa. So now we start looking at the mucosa. And then the layer next to that is the lamina propria. And then, this is a really nice, deeply stained section. You can see the gastric glands. They look different here. We haven't got loads of those cells packed together. We're not seeing the tubular shape. Here we get to see the tubular shape. And then we see the gastric pits. Jump up to a higher power. Okay, those gastric pits. Isn't that just a beautiful section? There's the surface of the stomach there. There's a mucus covering to it again. We're seeing that simple columnar epithelium, and we're seeing that fold down into the gastric pits, these tubes here. And then as we get down here, look, so there's the gastric glands. Now those gastric glands actually look very organised, and they are simpler. They're not the same as what we saw in the body of the stomach. The same things aren't going on. So in the pylorus, we're more likely to see lots of neuroendocrine cells, so cells that are chucking out endocrine signals, hormones that are acting to have effects on the other cells of the stomach. We're still seeing lots of mucus glands, and we might see some parietal cells and what have you. But that's what I wanted to point out, mostly because remember this histology series is a look-see thing. So when people talk about the stomach and they say that the stomach has these cells and it's arranged like this in this area, but in other areas of the stomach it's a little bit different, here's an example. It looks a little bit different. No radical changes, it's just not quite the same as what we saw in the body of the stomach. That's all I wanted to point out. But if you remember parietal cells and chief cells, if you remember stomach acid and pepsinogen, and then you can add on top of that your signals like gastrin and what have you. So gastrin signals cells to produce hydrochloric acid. Anyway, the physiology can be added on. The physiology can be added on to this structure that we've looked at here. But that's the anatomy and the histology of the stomach. Remember, the anatomy is made of cells. We need to look at the cells to understand the gross anatomy, and that's what we're doing here. Cool, right. See you in a few weeks when I get back from climbing mountains, and we'll look at the next bit of the gastrointestinal tract.